Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you. Recognizing we don't have as many participants as we typically do, I would ask that if you are settled and in a space where it is safe to do so, that you do turn on your camera so that we can see you and have an opportunity to engage. It's both for ourselves as a cohort as well as for our guest speaker. So recognizing he is new to this space, always good to orient by seeing who is joining us. So today, before I kick things off, I have a few brief announcements for us. I have followed up with individuals who have not yet completed the research and partnership theme spreadsheet. However, there are still a few gaps. So please, if you have not yet done that, that is required. That is the whole goal of the consortium. So please make sure that that is done by the end of this week. As well, if your goal or question to be answered, or if anything has shifted or evolved throughout your research, feel free to add another column with some additional text highlighting how that process has changed or shifted for you. I think that's going to be super interesting for your fellow students as well. Oh, sorry. Okay, great. Then I also wanted to take some time today to revisit the final assignment, recognizing we are over halfway through the fellowship. So bear with me one moment while I share my screen and I can revisit those instructions. So let's see here. Right, so for your final assignment, this information was delivered earlier in the year. So this is in the PowerPoint from our first session. What I am asking of everyone for their final assignment is to draft a summary report of your work over this semester. In doing so, please ensure that the following questions are addressed. I want to know how you identified your research theme or identified the partnership that you pursued. What were the pressing issues within your community that you were hoping to address? What resources helped inform your decision? Did the external speakers support in this process? Was it current events from your community? Then what actions were taken in pursuit of your goal in identifying and actually undertaking your research or your partnership? Who did you contact? What did you research? What connections were established? And what were your findings? Then I need to know, what are the next steps? What are the short and long-term steps necessary to further advance your work or the work of your law school in this space? Then if you have recommendations that you would have about how the fellowship might be structured going forward to better support the advancement of your partnership or research, that will be welcomed so that I can know how I can continue to grow and shape this future iterations of the fellowship in a way that is meaningful for those undertaking it. The deadline for this is April 14th, and this is where the real challenge is. Shorter is definitely better for this. I say a maximum of 3 pages with an 11-point font and 1.5 double spacing. I don't really care what font you use, but I emphasize that I want it to be short and succinct because I oftentimes find it more challenging to write in that manner, as you may have noticed from some of my more lengthy emails. But having the ability to summarize key findings in a short, succinct way is incredibly valuable, particularly as you enter into the next steps of your academic and professional careers. So I'm going to stop sharing because I can't see the chat when I'm doing so, but want to ask if folks have questions about that final assignment. Okay. Okay. Great. I will take silence as appreciation for the work ahead. And yes, I will look forward to receiving those submissions. Great. So today we are joined, one additional point. Recognizing the last component of that assignment is asking for recommendations on how fellowship might be structured. I will also be distributing a post-fellowship survey that will be anonymous. So know that that information will be asked in 2 separate spaces, recognizing some folks might be more comfortable in submitting their feedback anonymously. So if that final, I think it's the 5th bullet in that assignment, if it's not covered in your work, I'm not going to stress about it too much. I am really just looking more for information on summarizing your research or partnership throughout the semester. And feedback is always sought, but again, I acknowledge that doing so anonymously can provide additional comfort to some. So today, we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Frank Straub. He has conducted in-depth studies of targeted mass violence events in multiple communities and leads the Averted School, we'll talk a bit more about whether we're using current or past tenses momentarily, the Averted School Violence Project at the National Policing Institute, which is a national database funded by the US Department of Justice, Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, that tracks, analyzes, and reports on averted and completed school attacks. He has also led a Department of Homeland Security funded Countering Violent Extremism project in Boston, Massachusetts, and consults with several non-governmental organizations in counter-extremism and counterterrorism. Dr. Straub has served for more than 30 years in federal, state, and local law enforcement, and has led law enforcement and public safety agencies in New York, Indiana, and the state of Washington. He will speak a bit more about his biography and what led him to this work, as well as some exciting professional developments of his own throughout his presentation. But Dr. Straub, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I give the floor to you.
Great, great. Thank you. Thank you all for taking time to meet with me tonight. I do apologize ahead of time. My daughter will be leaving shortly for basketball, so the dogs may start barking, but that should only happen for a little bit. But that's what happens when you have 3 dogs. They tend to collaborate and bark together. So I'm going to try to share my screen. It worked well in practice, so it should work well in reality, we hope. There we go. Can everybody see it?
We can.
Okay, awesome. So what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is what I feel is an incredibly important subject, tragically so. It really is about the issue of both averted and completed school attacks. I have had the privilege since 2016 of leading, as Jessica said, the Department of Justice sponsored, funded Averted School Violence Database project. We were awarded those funds, we being the National Policing Institute, in 2016 to create a database that would track both averted and completed attacks. And so I helped build the database and have continued to administer the database until current times. I will be leaving the National Policing Institute at the end of this month to join a project as the co-director at Michigan State University's Department of Psychiatry. And I'll be also working with an organization called Safe and Sound Schools. Safe and Sound Schools was started right after the Sandy Hook shooting by 2 women who lost their daughters at Sandy Hook during the shooting. And since then has been dedicated to improving school safety. And so Michigan State and Safe and Sound Schools have partnered to implement a program that has been funded by the state of Michigan for the next 5 years to hopefully identify high-risk, high-need adolescents and connect them to community-based services, provide them mentoring, and stay with them and their caregivers for 5 years of the program. We're funded through September of 2027. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the presentation. So, as we all know, sadly, school violence continues to represent a vexing challenge for all of us. The most recent attack that received significant notoriety was the Michigan State University attack only a few weeks ago. As we all know, tragically, students in that case lost their lives and others were critically injured and continue to recover. One of the things that we realized in 2015, 2016, when we were contemplating the reality of mass violence, both in public venues, but also in schools, was that there were really, thank God, more averted attacks than there were completed attacks. And so a group of subject matter experts who were working with DOJ came to the conclusion that if we were able to study the averted cases, we could potentially learn some incredibly valuable lessons that may help us prevent future attacks. And that's how the Averted School Violence Database came into being. The database tracks both averted and completed incidents of targeted school violence. These incidents are typically identified in the public domain. They're reported sometimes by law enforcement, by school officials, parents, sometimes students. When an incident comes into the database, we have a team that reviews the incident and scrubs it to remove all individual identifiers, as well as to protect the anonymity of the school, the suspect or suspects, and any intended victims. If you're interested in seeing some of the cases or incidents that are recorded in the database, as well as seeing some of the reports that have been published, the URL is on the screen right now, avertedschoolviolence.org. In 2001, with, again, the support of the COPS office, we released a report in which we analyzed 171 averted cases. Also in March, the US Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center released their analysis of targeted school violence, and averted cases were primarily drawn from our database. They looked at about 65 cases and did in-depth case studies of those incidents. And so you see their report, the 2021 Averted Targeted School Violence Report, as well as ours. Ours can be found on the Averted School Violence Data website, and the Secret Service report can be found on their website. So I'm going to share some of the statistics from our 2021 report. As you can see, most states in the United States has experienced at least one averted attack that was reported to the database. Of the 171 cases that we examined, 153 of them took place in public schools. Only 8 took place in private schools, and then you can see the numbers diminish significantly. The majority of the cases took place in both rural and suburban areas versus urban areas. Again, when we're looking at the criteria for our database, it is attacks that were directed at the school, teachers, or students in the school. So we discount shootings in and around school areas, on blocks where schools may be. We exclude gang activity. We exclude shootings that are purely relational. Those tend to get picked up by other databases that are out there. Ours, the focus has to be the school as the location or intended location of the attack. You can see from this slide that the typical place where we saw averted attacks, and these statistics are valid for both averted and completed attacks. The primary school location was high schools, followed by middle schools and college and universities, with college and universities having slightly more averted attacks than middle and high schools. Interestingly, the populations for the K through 12 schools were relatively small. 500 to 1,000 was the predominant population, closely followed by 1,000 to 2,000. So of that number, about 93 of the averted school attacks that we looked at from the database out of the 171 took place in schools with relatively small student populations. The demographics for both averted and completed school attacks, again, continue to track fairly similarly. Most of the attacks that we looked at that were averted were planned by males. Most of those individuals who planned school attacks were younger than the age of 18. And most of the individuals were white. So the pattern looks like white males younger than 18 who are white. When we look at some of the reasons given for planning a school attack, the primary two reasons were that the individuals said that they hated people, that they were seeking revenge, that they had grudges against the school, against teachers, against fellow students. There was a significant number, 15, and these are reports, so the numbers could have been higher, that experienced bullying. You see that the mental health piece, which is commonly cited in the press, of the 171 cases, only 141 really reported that they had significant diagnosed mental health challenges in terms of paranoid delusions and hallucinations. Sorry, I skipped a slide. Some of the characteristics of the averted attackers: impaired social and emotional functioning, depressed mood, disregard for authority and rules, social withdrawal and isolation from their peers. They lacked empathy, lacked guilt, and lacked remorse. And you see some of the other criteria there. Most of the averted attacks, and in fact the carried out attacks, were perpetrated by one suspect, 132 out of 171. And most of those individuals planned to use firearms in the attacks. Again, in most of the completed attacks, firearms were the predominant weapon. Interestingly, we find an overlap in a significant number of cases of firearms and improvised explosive devices. So some of the key takeaways from the database is that most of the averted attacks involved a single attacker. Most of those individuals were currently enrolled students or recently enrolled students. We'll talk about that a little bit more. They were adolescent males between the ages of 14 and 18. They took place in high schools, or they would have taken place in high schools, in schools that were in suburban or rural areas, relatively small school populations, and they involve firearms or explosives. What I'd like to do now is kind of demonstrate some of the challenges that come from these statistics. There was a case here in the state of Michigan where I live, in a very small rural community, Paw Paw, Michigan. And I'm going to run through that case study, and then hopefully that will generate a good conversation amongst all of us regarding not only the database and the data in it, but also the case study. I would like to pause for a moment and remember victims of the South Haven pier shooting, which was an extension of the Averted high school shooting, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, as well as all the victims of targeted violence that unfortunately have been either killed or seriously injured from these horrific acts. So we don't talk about the individuals by name who either planned or perpetrated acts of violence. This is a picture of AI. He lived with his mother's boyfriend, and his three sisters in a community called South Haven, Michigan. Population of the community is relatively small, about 3,900 residents. And after 2 years of high school, he moved to the village of Paw Paw, which was even a smaller community of 3,500 residents. He had, of the three sisters, two were biological sisters. He and his two biological sisters had no relationship with their father. He had moved to Texas at a young age for all the children. When AI moved to Paw Paw, he attended a high school with only 686 students in it. He did have throughout his academic career, both elementary school, middle school, and high school, significant academic struggles. And his family members indicated to us that he had difficulty making friends throughout his school years. He did have a close relationship with his grandfather. At one point in time, he had a girlfriend, which we'll talk about a bit, a little bit later. Some of his classmates described him and one of his friends as being bullies. Others indicated that AI himself may have been bullied in his high school experience. When he moved from South Haven to Paw Paw, he did keep in touch with four relatively long-term male friends. We believe that those four individuals were probably, over the course of his life, his closest friends. So as I mentioned, he did have a girlfriend in Paw Paw. Interestingly, she came to the house once or twice, and on one occasion, he did invite her up to his bedroom. And what's interesting about that is that nobody was allowed in his bedroom. His mom allowed in there. His mother's boyfriend wasn't allowed in there. His sisters weren't allowed in there. And if in fact they went into his bedroom, he became extremely excited, very upset, very agitated. And so we found it interesting that he would in fact invite his girlfriend to go into his bedroom with him. During their time, he did tell her about some criminal activity that he had been involved in his younger years. He at one point asked her if she knew anybody that could help him buy ammunition. She said after the fact, after he was arrested and interviewed by the police, that she had observed what she thought were pipe bombs in his bedroom. Um, and throughout their relatively short-lived relationship, her friends didn't approve of the relationship, and it eventually came to a fairly tumultuous ending when he accused her of cheating on him on in social media. He did, as I mentioned, have one fellow classmate that was a friend of his at Paw Paw. I guess my daughter or my wife would refer to him as a friend of me, so a friend and an enemy. Um, and apparently, this other individual was involved with a white supremacist group. In fact, he confirmed that, as did his parents. Both he and AI were prone to make racist remarks. They also were prone to make violent statements. Um, and the girlfriend described him as AI's best friend. Were not convinced that they were best friends. Others felt that this other individual may have bullied AI on numerous occasions. So on February 22nd, 2018, AI is in a class. He's sitting next to this friend of me, and they're passing back and forth AI's notebook. And as you can see on a couple of the pages that we put on the slide, he has photographs of firearms and the various parts of firearms. He has some pretty accurate descriptions of how to make Molotov cocktails and other improvised explosive devices, including a pressure cooker bomb, which was used at the Boston Marathon. So he did his homework, and the drawings and the notes that went with them were pretty concerning. So the teacher took AI and a friend down to the principal's office. The friend was allowed to leave and AI remained. They called an evaluator from the district. We're not quite sure what the training level was of the evaluator, but we were told somebody who was able to do behavioral threat assessments. They also called the sheriff's department, who sent over a detective to the school. Both the officer and the evaluator were concerned about the drawings. AI told them that he was just building a video game, and that these were drawings that he used to help build the video game. They were unable to come up with any grounds to discipline him, to suspend him from the school, or to arrest him. In fact, the police, the sheriff's officer, asked if he could go and do a consent search of AI's bedroom, which AI's mother agreed to. During the search, they didn't find anything that would have allowed them to effectuate an arrest, or again, to move with some type of disciplinary actions against AI. Interestingly, though, AI did ask his mom if he could talk to a therapist, if he could speak to a mental health provider. We know his mom called the community mental health agency in the community. Unfortunately, she never received a return phone call from them, and AI never was able to avail himself to any community mental health services. We're not sure if they made any follow-up calls or if it was a once and done. We were unable to interview AI's mother as part of our case study. So remember, we have this event or this incident in February. Now on March 18th, really less than a month later, two things happen simultaneously. AI comes down from his bedroom and says to his mom, "I don't want you to drive my sisters to school tomorrow, and I don't think they should go on the bus. They need to stay home." At the same time this was happening, the phone rings, and it's AI's grandfather, and the grandfather tells AI's mother that there was something weird going on in his workshop, that he had found metal shavings, that his circular saw blades were dull, and that he was missing two firearms. AI admitted that in fact he had taken two of his grandfather's firearms and that he had used a circular saw to cut the barrels down so that they would fit into his backpack, and in fact told his mother and his mother's boyfriend that the firearms were upstairs in his bedroom, and told them where they could be located. AI's mother took him to the sheriff's office in Van Buren County. AI was interviewed and arrested, and we'll come back to this hopefully in the questions and answers. But AI and his lawyer were able to negotiate a plea bargain in juvenile court as opposed to adult court. The prosecutor wanted to charge AI as an adult. At the time of the offense, he was 18 years old, so he was right on the cusp. He could have been charged as an adult legally, but the judge made the decision that he should go instead to a juvenile inpatient facility. He ended up pleading guilty to two firearms and explosive-related felony charges. So there were two different journals that were found. One was found after the March 18th incident. Some entries that are worth noting is that in February of 2018, he detailed very graphically how he had captured a cat and tortured it for several days and ultimately killed it. He wrote about his interest in bombing the 4th of July celebrations in South Haven, which is a very big tourist community during the summer. It's right on Lake Michigan, and that he, had thought about using a pressure cooker bomb. He told detectives that he had planned this as well, but didn't go forward with it because when he went up to the July 4th celebration, he saw too big of a police presence and was afraid that he would be caught. And so he, at that point, decided that he would attack his high school. On the 17th of March, so the day before he's arrested, he talks about the fact that because of the events that had transpired in February, he felt that he had to move more quickly and step up the attack at his high school and plan to do it the following day. He also talked about how proud he was of himself for deceiving the police during that February school interview. So some things about AI and violent content. He was an avid reader of violence-related books, books on the Third Reich, about the Zodiac Killer, violent fiction such as Clockwork Orange. He had a fairly extensive list of mass killers and attackers, including Timothy McVeigh, the Unabomber, Lee Harvey Oswald, and others. He read instructional books on handgun combat techniques, and he had a copy of the Anarchist Cookbook, which We can all buy on Amazon should we want to. He had conducted numerous searches on high-ranking Nazi Germany officials. He had a variety and a plethora, really, of violent drawings, and he had engaged in prior acts of violence, as mentioned, animal cruelty, and he had also allegedly set his neighbor's shed on fire. These are some of the drawings that were in his second notebook, if you will, his journal. As you can see, misogynistic in nature, violent in nature, referencing the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacists and other organizations. As I mentioned, he was very much consumed by A Clockwork Orange, to the point where he even mimicked the main character's dress. So if you've seen A Clockwork Orange, there is a point in there where the main character is wearing tighty whities over his clothes. And shortly before AI started at Paw Paw High School, he actually was observed by what would be a classmate taking his garbage out in his tighty whities. And that classmate ended up filming him and putting it on social media. So when AI went into Paw Paw, he already had this viral video of him taking out his garbage in tighty whities. The police did a search of his computer to see what type of searches had been conducted. And as you can see, there were numerous searches that involved Nazi content, firearms content, research around school shootings, hate-based and segregation and Black caricature, drawings, how to build bombs and other explosives. So what we see in AI is the convergence of conspiracy theories, of racism, of misogyny, anarchism, all coming together in one individual. And many of these belief systems dehumanize individuals or certain individuals or groups. They talk about using weapons. They talk about making violent threats to third parties, to not only defining, but expressing and acting on their grievances. So some of the things from this first part is some good things happen. The teacher recognized and reported a potential threat. That recognition was followed up quickly by some level of threat assessment and some level of police investigation. When the grandfather and the mother recognized the danger, they took AI to the sheriff's office. They didn't hesitate. They didn't try to solve the problem themselves. And in fact, he ended up pleading guilty, and he was placed in a juvenile facility, which was not just a place of incarceration, but also a place in which we know he received treatment. So we see points of intervention here. The recognition of his propensity towards violence and homicidal, suicidal ideation at the school. We see opportunities for early intervention. We see opportunities for a mental health assessment and treatment to directed at his suicidal or homicidal ideation. And we see some good communication amongst the various actors, the school officials, the law enforcement officials, the judicial officials, and so on and so forth. So, as I said, AI is incarcerated in a juvenile facility. And one of the psychiatrists there who evaluated him found multiple psychiatric symptoms. Um, those symptoms that she enumerated in her report included anxiety, mood disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and psychosis. She noted that he expressed grandiose delusional thinking, mood, and anxiety symptoms. Um, I also practice as a therapist and have a license as a master's level psychologist here in Michigan. And so between my practice and my work, I've read an awful lot of reports by psychologists and psychiatrists. This one was particularly interesting in that it appeared that the psychiatrist was really throwing the kitchen sink at her report and in her report, and really tried everything she could to articulate that AI, in fact, was dangerous. He ended up being released from the facility because he had spent a year there, but also because he aged out. He turned 19 and could no longer be held in a juvenile facility. And because of the plea agreement, there was no provision to move him to an adult facility. So he was released on November 4th, 2019, back into the community. He was on probation. He ended up living with his grandparents versus his mother. And he ended up getting a job and seemed to be doing fairly well, to the point that on July 20th, 2021, the judge released him from all court supervision. On August 19th of 2021, really a very short time after being released from any supervision, AI recorded a video. We viewed the video in its entirety. We have chosen not to share that publicly. It was not shown in court either. But some of the themes that AI expressed in the video were low self-worth, a history of suicidal thoughts. He began thinking about committing suicide as a young child, all through elementary school, through middle school, and through high school. He talked about the fact that the next day he was going to commit a mass shooting and follow that up by killing himself. He talked about being bullied. He talked about the underwear incident that I mentioned earlier. And then he talked about his grievances. He talked about his grievances towards individuals, no names attached, that used drugs and were addicted to substances. He talked about the relationships that he had tried to form and how they had failed. He talked about his perception of racial inequities and his hatred for people. All of this time, he was holding a 9mm pistol that he would point at himself periodically, or at the phone on which he made the recording. At the end, he talked about what he wanted his family to do with his property and his body, and said his goodbyes to his family. The next day, he returned to South Haven. He walked out onto a pier, a very picturesque pier. If you Google the South Haven Pier, you'll see at the end of it a lighthouse, and it's a place that many people go to visit. It's a very much a tourist community with a number of shops and restaurants. And he walked out onto the pier towards the end, towards the lighthouse, and walked up behind a husband and wife who were observing the sunset, and shot both of them. He killed the husband and critically wounded the individual's wife. He then walked back towards the beach and just randomly fired at individuals that were on watercraft, jet skis, and boats near the pier. He fired at people on an adjoining pier. He fired at people on the beach. Fortunately, he did not hit any of those other individuals. And then he stopped about halfway down the pier and committed suicide. The firearm that was recovered on the scene was the same firearm that was observed in the video. He had etched a swastika onto that firearm and also the numbers 1488. As you can see, H is the 8th letter of the alphabet, and 88 signifies Heil Hitler, with 14 referring to a white supremacist slogan. So some of the things that I think are really critical for us to recognize is that individuals who pose a risk of violence to themselves or to others, that we see often goes hand in hand, that we see individuals with both suicidal and homicidal ideation. When anyone expresses thoughts about hurting themselves or hurting others, we believe it demands immediate response. It is a true medical and mental health emergency. We need to try to identify individuals who are at risk for violence as early as possible. The whole idea is we don't want them to be at the point where they're drawing sketches in a notebook, when they're building bombs, when they're acquiring firearms, when they're planning an attack. We want to identify high risk, high need adolescents as quickly as possible, and I'll talk more about that momentarily. Sadly, we often believe that arrest and incarceration reduce the risk of dangerous, but as we see in the case of AI, it really only stalled his intention to commit an act of mass violence. We do think that multidisciplinary approaches offer great hope in terms of our response to these individuals. We look at the response on a tiered approach that follows in many ways the public health model. Prevention, community-wide prevention and education around early warning signs and risk factors, crisis or immediate intervention, and then long-term treatment and monitoring. It really does take a village. It really does take a multidisciplinary approach to bring assistance and interventions to these individuals. And so I talked about at the beginning of the presentation the fact that I would be leaving the National Policing Institute. So shortly after the Paw not the Paw incident, the shooting in Michigan at the high school, the governor's office here reached out to us and asked us, being myself and a colleague, Dr. Elise Lai, who's a child and adolescent psychiatrist at Michigan State University, asking us if we had some thoughts around how we could maybe intervene in shootings like the Oxford shooting and the Paw event. And we shared with the governor's office a model that we had been developing over the past several years that we thought represented some real hope in this regard. And we're very fortunate that both the governor and the state legislature funded the project. We have $15 million to implement the project over the next 5 years. And the project is called the Adolescent Targeted Violence Prevention Project. As I mentioned earlier, it's a collaboration between Michigan State University's Department of Psychiatry and Safe and Sound Schools. And in the model, we will have a team, a hub team, we're calling it, at Michigan State Psychiatry that'll be staffed by subject matter experts from psychiatry, social work, education, law enforcement, behavioral threat assessment. And then we're going to have 5 regional teams that will serve the Michigan community, or 5 communities. And each one of those teams will have a master's level social worker, clinical social worker, and at least 1 mentor. And the idea of the program is that if a middle or high school student is evaluated as being at high risk for violence, that would be the first step in the referral to our program. We would then evaluate the work of the behavioral threat assessment team. We'd evaluate any paperwork that they were able to make available to us with the consent of the child, or if they were old enough, if not, their parents or guardians. And then we would determine what the next steps would be, whether they need a more extensive threat assessment, whether they need a psychiatric or psychological evaluation. And then with that, we would work with the parents and the caregivers and community assets, stakeholders, to develop a care plan and implement the care plan. And then we would stay with the child and their family for the length of the project, providing whatever supports and assistance we could in helping them navigate the various systems that are out there. And we believe it's critically important to not only work with the adolescent, but also their caregivers, and to really help mobilize resources to address physical health problems, mental health challenges, economic challenges, school-related challenges, with the hope of building this multi-layered, multidisciplinary support structure around these individuals, to hopefully move them on a different life trajectory away from violence. So that's my presentation. I think we have almost a half hour for questions and thoughts and comments. That is my new title, and come April 3rd, and the new organization. That is my personal email, but I'm still in this transition stage. So if there were any follow-up questions or whatever, you can reach me via my personal email. So I guess I now open it up to all of you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Jessica, do you want to call on people?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, it's Jesselyn. But yes, I'm happy to.
I apologize, Jesselyn.
Of course. I just wanted to express my gratitude for that presentation. I will say that this is a slight deviation from some of our past presentations, but one that was wholly useful. And I just wanted to further make those connections for the students, that I think this is a great way of showcasing really what Frank was talking about, the wholes of society approach, and how we really need you both in your current capacity as researchers, as well as community members, as well as what you have ahead of you as lawyers and legal scholars, to incorporate and continue to advance this field and ensure that there is greater safety and security for both students as well as all those in the community. So I believe I've been clocking in order. So I'm going to go Holly, Rich, Katie, Sydney, but I'll start with Holly and I can reiterate after that.
Thank you so much for speaking to us today. This has been really, really interesting. Kind of curiosity and then a question. I'm interested in this scenario you presented to us. The family was really involved in intervening and preventing the initial attack. Do you find that in these prevented school shootings, are the families really involved in that? And then going off of that, how to determine which cases demand early intervention when so many young people are constantly exposed to violence, so many young people have access to firearms, have mental health problems, how to determine which threats are the most pressing?
Great questions. So in about 90% of both averted and completed school attacks, we see that bystanders, particularly in the averted attacks, reported them. We do find, sadly, that in 90% or more of the attacks that were completed, other individuals were aware that something was wrong at a minimum, if not aware that some type of act of violence was being planned by the individuals. So we believe that bystander intervention, whether it's family members, whether it's peers, whether it's colleagues, need to be involved. They need to report these events. As I mentioned, my colleague, Dr. Lai, is a child and adolescent psychiatrist. And we talk about the emergent nature of an individual talking about hurting themselves, talking about committing suicide, talking about hurting others. And we have to start to look at these individuals as persons that are deeply distressed, that are reaching out, that are asking for help. And we've done amazing things when you think about it in this country. And we'll use cardiac arrest as a great example. Probably all of us know at a baseline the symptoms of cardiac arrest. We all know that if somebody's experiencing those symptoms, we should call 911 at a minimum. Many of us have learned CPR. Many of us have learned how to use defibrillators. And what we see is that in cities like Seattle, where there's these tremendous efforts to engage the community and to train the community around the warning signs and around CPR and around the use of defibrillators, we see a decrease in mortality rates attributable to cardiac arrest in public places. Well, we have to look at individuals talking about hurting themselves, talking about killing others as a true medical emergency, and we need to take action. At a minimum, we need to engage individuals and services that can help these persons. It doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be a call to law enforcement, but there needs to be a call at a minimum to mental health services. There needs to be a conversation with the individual, if it's appropriate, to get them connected to services. And we can't just let these people really go into a situation where their challenges become worse and worse. We have to try to get them help. And there are, at least in schools in many states now, if not most states, anonymous reporting systems where somebody can make a report, it goes to a central location, it can be triaged, and then the appropriate resources can be mobilized and directed towards the person. So bystander involvement is critically important. Sadly, we just see the numbers of individuals challenged by mental health issues, whether they're diagnosed or not, increasing. We see it escalating at alarming rates among adolescents and children, young adults. The numbers seem to be particularly high amongst males, higher than they are amongst females. And so your question is a good one in terms of who needs help and when do they need help. I mean, obviously, at baseline, we have to improve the care we provide to members of our community around mental health. We have to reduce the stigma mental health. I'm seeing somebody now in my private practice who is a firefighter, and it took him several months before literally his fire chief grabbed him by the back of the neck and said, "You're going for counseling because I'm really worried about your behavior. I'm really worried about the statements you're making." And was able to connect me through someone else to him, and now we're engaged in therapy. But again, it's that term that I used earlier, and it's not a political term in any way. It does take a village. It does take a community. We don't want to be that person who says after somebody has committed an act of violence or has hurt themselves, you know, I always was worried. I always thought something was weird. We have to take action. In my 30 years of law enforcement, unfortunately, I buried several officers who committed suicide. And at almost every single service, I heard the same thing. I knew they were struggling. I knew they were having challenges. And we got to do better. We have to do better as communities, as individuals, as advocates, to make sure that we get people connected, and we really look at these broken systems that are out there that aren't delivering the level of care that we need. And that was one of the impetus for our program, is that individuals that are thinking about harming themselves, that are thinking about committing an act of violence, that's not 24 sessions of therapy and then out the door. It's not antidepressant medication and out the door. These individuals need somebody to stay with them, and often with their caregivers, for an extended period of time, and to, in essence, ride the waves with them. Be with them when things are going well, but also be with them and ready to intervene when things are crashing around them. So I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Rich?
Hi, Dr. Straub. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I have a bunch of questions, but I don't want to monopolize everyone's time here. So I'm gonna try to ask them in short format. So the subjects of the study are averted, like people who like, I guess, never got to commit their crimes, or never actually got to.
They were stopped. Sometimes stopped at the door, sometimes stopped in their house, sometimes stopped in the school.
So it's because it seems almost like a negative data set, right? Like how, when do you start considering this averted? Like if you would have had, a guidance counselor early on in the process identify this behavior, and somebody like AI would have sought treatment. I mean, he never makes it into the study, right? Because he never gets far along enough in the chain to ever make contact with law enforcement or get flagged as somebody who was an averted mass shooter, correct?
And so hopefully he or she gets that treatment early on, because somebody recognizes their need for assistance and intervenes, and their life trajectory changes at that point away from violence. Or there's behavioral issues that suggest that somebody really needs help, or there's a life trauma that suggests that somebody needs help, and we intervene.
So we're really only studying those that get far enough along where law enforcement has to get involved.
In some cases, law enforcement never gets involved. I know of a few cases in the database where the individual in one case was in a counselor's office and took out a gun and said, I'm going to shoot you, and then I'm going to go shoot my fellow students. And that case was adjudicated without ever going to the criminal justice system.
Okay. I mean, I guess I wanted to take it back even, because that to me, that's still law enforcement contact. He pulled out a gun in school. I mean, it would require a law enforcement response, is what I mean to say.
Right.
Like, so we're only really dealing with people who have gotten that far to count them in your study.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. The second thing I wanted to ask is, in this multidisciplinary approach, in your opinion, like how much of it is law enforcement related as opposed to all the other disciplines that have a hand in this? Like, let's call it, what percentage would you say?
It depends on where we are in the plot to commit the act of violence, right? So if we're at I've got drawings in my notebook about violence. I'm talking about killing myself. Maybe I'm talking about hurting others. I haven't really committed a crime. I can draw whatever I want in my notebook, right?
Right.
I don't have access to firearms immediately. I don't have access to bomb making materials. That's a person of concern. That's a person who needs intervention services, but is not somebody that would be on law enforcement's radar. So I think the trick is, and the important issue is, that as soon as we start to see those very early warning signs, we intervene. So I talked a little bit about isolation and loneliness. Well, isolation comes in two ways. Some individuals choose to self-isolate. I don't want to be part of the group. And they may have always had that pattern of behavior. What becomes a warning sign is we're involved in group dynamics, you and I, right? We're in a club, we're in this or whatever. And all of a sudden, we don't want to be involved anymore. We separate ourselves from our friends. We separate ourselves from the groups that we're part of, and we withdraw. Well, the question becomes, why is this individual withdrawing? Other individuals are pushed through bullying and other life experiences away from what we would refer to as pro-social activities. That social isolation, we believe, is a critical factor. We also believe that a major life event can be a critical factor. The death of a parent, parents losing their job, parents losing their house, witnessing acts of violence, of traumatic violence. It could be a shooting on the street. It could be somebody dying from an overdose. All of those things are all pieces of what we believe are the puzzle that move somebody towards self-harm or committing an act of violence. And so being cognizant of those various factors are helping us put together the puzzle of, this is somebody who we need to help, and we need to help them now.
Okay, and I get, well, I mean, I'm in law enforcement myself, and it seems to me
That's
like,
not a bad thing. I was too.
yeah, I keep apologizing for it, but as someone who looks at these types of cases, it always seems like by the time that law enforcement is actually required, or even it comes to the attention of law enforcement, like so many red flags have already been up and brought to the attention of other groups. Like law enforcement is like the last straw. And when I hear you talk about that multidisciplinary approach, it's like those are all the other people who are hopefully the tip of the spear when it comes to preventing something like this, because they would have more interaction at the early stages than law enforcement might have at later stages. I mean, think about all the things that have to happen before law enforcement actually gets involved with someone, and there's even pushback about that. I mean, having someone have that law enforcement contact is already a negative. Like, what, these are things that when we're looking at school shootings anywhere, school violence, or even mass shootings of any kind, it's almost as if everyone else has a more important role, like all those other agencies and contacts and familial contacts and social contacts.
I don't want to say more important role. I think we all have a role, and we can't rely on somebody else to be the first person to take the step towards help and assistance. We all have to play that role. And so that's why we talk about multidisciplinary teams, because again, it's pieces of the puzzle. And if we can get all the pieces or a significant number of the pieces together, that gives us tremendous insight and increases our ability to not only act, but to act appropriately in this scenario. And so to say, well, it's law enforcement's job is wrong. To say it's a teacher's job is wrong. To say it's mental health's job, it's wrong. To say it's a parent's job, it's wrong. We all need to come together. And I think we all have to come together and not just drop somebody off at somebody else's door. Right? We have to set up, and that's where we see the value of our model, a interdisciplinary case management system where we're working collectively for the success of this individual and their family.
All right, last question, but I'm going to put you on the spot for this one. There's a lot of national talk about getting rid of SROs in schools. How do you feel about that? What is your research shown, like, or how do you feel that SROs, positive or negative, how would they affect the conversation?
So it is clear, sadly, that there is a history of disparate treatment that has been tied to SROs. Some of the challenges that I think go with that are that we, at points in time, took officers that we didn't want on the street anymore and put them in schools. And what we didn't do is look at being an SRO as almost a vocation within a vocation. That we had to really endeavor to select individuals who wanted to be in schools, who maybe had an interest in education, who had an interest in social work or mental health, who then received special training and unique training to be able to work in schools. We also have to stop the practice that schools use frequently of engaging SROs in the school disciplinary process. We all know, sadly, that when a student becomes too troublesome, we just try to push them further and further away. Sometimes we do it through discipline and suspensions. Sometimes we do it through alternative schooling. Sometimes, and it happened way too frequently, we use school resource officers to arrest students because that was a solution. Now they were arrested. Now they were moved out of the education system and into the criminal justice system. I have seen in my career across that spanned from New York State to the state of Washington, SROs who did miraculous work, that were mentors, that were crisis interveners, that were adult role models for young women and men. When I was in White Plains, New York, the SRO there couldn't walk down the hallway without 10, 15, 20 kids following him and hanging on him and talking to him. And we were able to stop so many things without real law enforcement activity, but going to parents and saying, hey, I know you're going away, but kids are planning to spend the weekend at your house partying. You might want to rethink that a little bit. Stopping gang issues, whether they were fights or shootings or retaliation, that never ended up in anybody being arrested. So I feel personally that the research suggests, and my anecdotal experience of 30 plus years, now almost 40 years in this business, that properly selected, properly trained, properly supervised school resource officers can have a significant impact in this process. But again, they're only one piece of the puzzle.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Rich. I appreciate you respecting the floor. If there's additional time at the end, I'm happy to circle back if you have additional questions. But Frank, just to your last comments, I'm seeing a lot of flavors from your past work in the CVE space, which I think is really interesting, and appreciate you bringing that into this conversation. Sydney's next.
Hi, how are you doing today?
Good, how are you?
Your work is very interesting, and I really appreciate your work with mental health as far as it comes with actual like juvenile delinquents, because I currently work in Department of Children and Family Services, and I work with kids who are adjudicated dependent based on their incarceration. So they're in the system for so long that by law they're adjudicated dependent. And so I was just kind of wondering, honestly, what in like if you don't mind discussing what in this fact and what in this case specifically allowed this juvenile AI specifically to be tried as a juvenile, even though he exhibits a lot of repetitive behavior, volatile behavior, destructive behavior. And based upon what you said about his video, his current video at 19, he doesn't really have a different outlook on life right now. So that means that he probably has some trigger that could revert him back to his 15-year-old self. So I was just wondering, what do you think, based off your research, based off your case study, put in the judge's mind to try him as a juvenile instead of as an adult, which is where you see a lot of children who have minor behavior issues, such as they fight too much in school, maybe they steal from their parents, maybe they, you know what I'm saying, they just have like behavior issues. They end up in the system charged as adults as early as 16 years old. So I was just wondering, what do you think was the reasoning for charging him as a juvenile instead of as an adult?
Yeah, so there was a big debate between the prosecutor and AI's defense counsel. And the prosecutor argued that just the mere fact that he was going to attack the school, that he had deliberately altered firearms to use in the attack, that he had built improvised explosive devices, that he posed a very serious threat to society, and incarceration over an extended period of time in an adult facility was necessary to protect society. She also, the prosecutor, articulated that she thought the level of services that he would get in an adult correctional facility would be better and potentially more comprehensive than he would receive in a juvenile facility. The defense counsel argued that he was on the cusp, that he could be tried as either a juvenile or as an adult, that yes, he did have this ideation. Yes, he did accumulate firearms, but he was a deeply troubled person who really needed intensive mental health services much more than he did punishment for his act. And in fact, he hadn't hurt anybody, at least at that point. The cat, the shed, but there was no indication of or any record of assaultive behavior towards other individuals. The judge took both sides into consideration and ruled in favor of the adult facility, with the belief that AI would receive very intensive therapy. And I don't know that the judge was necessarily wrong in that position. I think, at that point, hindsight is always 20/20, but from what everybody knew at that point, it was not the wrong decision. The problem comes not just from the treatment that he received or didn't receive in the juvenile facility, but now he's released on probation. And again, we're talking about a very, very rural area of Michigan. And yes, they have state DOC probation officers that were working with him. But those probation officers really weren't trained to deal with an individual who had his level of suicidal or homicidal ideation. They, to our knowledge, never did a home inspection. They never went into the home. They never went up to his bedroom. Had they done so, they would have probably found the firearm, the handgun. They would have found extensive literature, as we talked about, all indications that maybe, despite the fact that he had a job and appeared to be adjusting, he was still struggling and was struggling massively. They also would have found that he was not taking the medications that he had been prescribed by the psychiatrist in the juvenile facility. So the point being that when individuals come out of facilities, be they adult facilities or juvenile facilities, we have to really do very extensive risk assessments, threat assessments, and really develop a care plan that allows us to work with these individuals in community settings and continue whatever therapeutic or care plans that were put in place to do everything we can to move them away from self-harm or harm to others.
So do you know what the actual like pinpoint in the argument, do you know what the actual pinpoint in the argument was that the judge decided, okay, he should be a juvenile instead of an adult? Because like you just said, hindsight's 20/20, yes. But like from what I've heard and what I'm reading, it doesn't sound like anything about it was a innocent juvenile mistake. You know what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't sound like it was like a one-off, oh, I stole $200 from my mom's rent money. This was like a long leading up, like drawings, like he had this mindset for a very long time, but yet the judge was like, he's still a child, he'll get over it. But he's now
I
out.
thought that he would get over it. I think he thought that the level of intervention would be more appropriate for AI's age and maturity level that he would receive in an adult facility. And
Okay. So it's just his age, like just basically because he was 15. Like if he'd have been 17, would it
no, he
been
was
different?
Yeah, but you got to remember, right? The human brain doesn't fully develop until the age of 23, 24, 25. So 17, 18, 19, you still have a fairly developing brain. And so I think the judge felt that adult incarceration would have an adverse effect on him, and that there was hope if he went to a juvenile facility for rehabilitation and building resilience.
Okay, thank you so much.
Katie.
Hi, thank you so much. I really appreciate this talk. My research area is on SROs, and kind of as it relates to like school surveillance and school violence. So that this is really helpful in that regard. I had a follow-up question, which I think is probably kind of pretty similar in spirit. For those of us who are doing clinical work in criminal defense, like we see people, a lot of men who were charged as young adults or adolescents for lesser offenses and who, decades ago, right? And who are still paying for it, who are still seeing their life choices limited by convictions and plea deals that were negotiated when they were young. And it's very clear that race, ethnicity, skin color plays a major part in that. And so my question is, here you have, in this context, you have an 18-year-old white man who made racist remarks, sought out white supremacist content, drew racist and misogynistic things, and was tracked, who was charged as a juvenile rather than adult, and released from court supervision. So my question is, from a law enforcement perspective, how does that type of charge compare to that charge and disposition compare to what you typically see for young people who are convicted for drug charges, weapon charges, gang violence, which may also be associated with trauma and mental health issues? And then I have a follow-up question about kind of your role as a male therapist and thinking about kind of masculinity as part of this, or that's presumptive, but that's a follow-up question.
I'll try to answer your first one. So Paw Paw and Van Buren County is a predominantly white rural farming community. It, I would say overall leans right of center, probably relatively far right of center in certain areas. Did that impact the outcome of the case? Probably. I think that the bigger issue is that we're still relatively naive in this country as to the real danger that has been that is posed by in many ways the way we've behaved for too long and gotten away with it. Our acceptance of ideologies that are really geared towards dehumanizing individuals, men, women, regardless, right, ethnicity, races, and really have we taken much of a stand against it? You know, we live in such a polarized country. I mean, I'm 64 years old. I've never seen anything like this. I'm incredibly troubled by it and concerned about it, in all honesty. I think we live in, to use a cliche phrase, dangerous times. But, you know, I look at all of you on this call, and this isn't cliche, but this is your time, right? And as you know, President Obama said when he was a candidate, it really is the urgency of now. I don't think we can wait for somebody else to take action. I think we all are called to be activists, and we have to do whatever we can to stop the direction that large factions of this country are moving in. And your daughter's very pretty, by the way.
Yeah.
If mine wasn't at basketball practice, she'd be sitting here also. But no, it's very troubling. But you know, you all are going into a profession that you can really influence in many ways the direction of local government and state government and national government. And you can use the law to do it. A very good friend of mine left law enforcement, became a social worker, runs a program for persons with disabilities, and now has chosen to go to law school because she thinks she needs another tool in her belt to be a stronger advocate for these individuals. Well, we need more people, you know, like Leah, who are willing to jump in with both feet. And I think that's one of the things that we're proudest of the program that we're initiating, is we've chosen to jump into this space and not just do research with it, but to actually develop and implement and study interventions, and at least take some small percentage of people under our guidance for 5 years and hopefully help them and their families.
Frank, thank you so much for that. I want to be mindful of your time as we are at 6:30. I do see 2 more hands raised. If I could be so bold, if you have additional time, I would love for them to be asked, but I understand if you have commitments that might be pulling you away.
We probably have no more than 10 minutes, so if we can go quick, I'll take the questions.
Great, Madeline, and then Katie, rapid fire.
Okay, I'll make this quick. Thank you for your time. I'm really interested in the data you provided about what kind of the behavioral background of these individuals who we're looking at looks like. I'm very interested in how these individuals procure firearms and or explosive devices. Do you have data on like what is their typical methodology? Do they receive these firearms from family members? Like in this case, it was his grandfather's firearm that he was able to have access to. Or is it more typical for like straw purchases or, ghost gun builds, P80 lowers, and then them getting built so that they're not traceable? How do these individuals typically get their hands on these weapons?
I think for the averted and completed school attacks, most of them are getting weapons in their households or in easily accessible places, so a relative's house or whatever. So it's a failure to, in some cases, properly secure the firearms. That seems to be a consistent problem. That's at least in the school realm. In terms of community level violence, I think all of the things that you addressed are access points to firearms. And the reality is, if you wanted a firearm, my guess is that in about an hour, depending on where you live, you could get access to a firearm, either legally or illegally. Firearms are pervasive in our society, and it's not hard to get your hands on them.
Thank you.
Hi, Katie.
Thank you so much. My second question is like kind of the inversion of the first question, the assumptions under the first question, I think. I was just recently listening to a fascinating talk by Richard Reeves, who writes on masculinity and mental health. And one of the things that he talked about and discussed was how institutions on the left, but also I think institutions kind of broadly have taken kind of like a systemic approach to kind of rectifying issues of race or gender or disability, but that his kind of premise is that there's like a void on talking about masculinity specifically, and that when we talk about masculinity, for instance, in the context of young men who commit violent crimes, that we both kind of recognize the systemic factors that kind of lead them toward that, and we also individualize it, like in the phrase like toxic masculinity, and that has like real impacts for individuals, who then are part of culture and like take that in and internalize that. And so you, as I understand, you are a therapist who focuses on school violence that, as you describe it, is primarily committed by young men. When you kind of articulate the work that you're doing, is masculinity or talking about masculinity or thinking about kind of what it means to be like a man, like, is that part of it? And how is that part of it? And how do you kind of articulate and frame that part of it, if so? Not for you specifically, but like generally.
No. I think though we have a crisis in masculinity. I think we have a crisis in men and boys in this country. And I think that we used to say, well, it was, in certain ethnic groups or certain racial groups that there was this crisis. I think men across the spectrum and across the ages are in a deep state of crisis right now. I think there is a growing sense of loss there's a growing sense of lost belonging. I think there's a crisis in identity. I think that there are accelerating rates of depression and anxiety. And I'm not saying that those necessarily lead to violence, but I think we do. I think that we have a crisis amongst young men and adult males in society right now, that needs serious consideration and needs to be addressed.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Katie, I do wish you would have reversed the order of your questions, though, so that we could have ended on a slightly more upbeat note for.
My first one was a real upper, but
But,
yeah.
but we are ending on a good note, because you're all going to graduate from law school and you are going to go out into the world with the ability to change people's lives. Whether it's in corporate law or it's in government law or whatever it is, just do your job as you've been trained to do it, and do it with humanity and do it with empathy. And we can change every life that you come in contact with. And sometimes we can't change the criminal outcomes, but what we can leave a client with is the fact that we cared about him and that we tried really hard for him, and we saw them as a person, and we value them as who they are. So maybe you don't win every case, or maybe somebody doesn't get exonerated, or somebody doesn't leave jail, but if they leave the contact and the relationship believing that they're a valued human being at some level, that in and of itself could be something that changes somebody's life trajectory.
That's really beautiful. Frank, thank you for that, and also ensuring that we're able to end on a slightly brighter note. And that I know that we truly value you and the time that you were able to take with us and sharing your expertise time with our students today, and also recognizing the weight of our topic today. I want to also reiterate my value for all of the students within this fellowship. If any of this brought up anything for you, if you want to have additional one-on-one conversations, please let me know, and I'm happy to do so next week, recognizing again how close this might hit to home for some of your schools based off of where you're located. But Stephen, I do see an additional question from you in the chat. I would point you towards Dr. Straub's email if you want to follow up directly, recognizing that we are at time. Next week, we will not have an external speaker, but we'll be able to have time amongst ourselves to talk about our research, do a bit of a check-in, and let everyone have more information about where you have progressed, where you have struggled, and really just have more time to interact as a fellowship. So very much looking forward to that opportunity. I hope you all take care of yourselves, be kind. It is the first day of spring, I believe, so make sure you do something spring-like that brings you joy, and know that I look forward to seeing you next Monday. Be well, and I will see you then.
Thank you all.